We've had our fair share of cocktail time watches from Seiko on the channel already. They have both been limited editions with beautifully textured dials. It's the dials from this line that Seiko is famous for after all. And so, what we're looking at today is technically not a cocktail time, but it might as well be. Welcome to Addicted to Watches. Today, we're looking at another watch from what many call the golden age of Seiko, a time when you could get a very well-specced, well-designed watch from the brand for a price that didn't make your wallet recoil in horror. Many of the coveted watches from this period come from their JDM line, and this one is no different. It's the watch that more or less birthed the Cocktail Time series. This is the Seiko SARB065. While this may have birthed the Cocktail line series, that particular line from Seiko has grown and expanded to encompass more case sizes, movement types, dial styles, and textures. One thing that pretty much all of them share though, is that they are stunning to look at. They all have fantastic dials that look like they belong on watches costing much more than they do, and are one of, if not the best looking dress watches you can find for the price from a big brand. As the line grew, Seiko even decided to recreate this one, which is still in production as the SARB065. The only difference between that watch and this one we have here is the word presage on the dial, and the movement powering the watch. But we'll get to that a bit later. Let's start off at the main reason this watch was and remains so popular, that dial. Looking at it from a distance versus looking at it close up make it look like a completely different dial. When you get close like this, you realize just how intricate that texture actually is, which results in the mesmerizing sunburst effect across the dial. It's generally considered to be ice blue in color, but depending on the way the light hits it, it can look more silver. Those lines radiate out from the center of the dial, and the way that they were arranged creates an effect that almost looks 3D, like each surface is curved slightly. Clearly, it's a dial that loves to play with the light, and on this watch Seiko went big with the dial, giving it lots of space to work its magic. There is some printing, but it's fairly minimal. Above the pinion we just have an applied Seiko logo that is relatively small, and below is the word automatic in a cursive script as well as 23 jewels. Around the dial, marking the hours, are multifaceted applied indices. The 12, 6 and 9 are all larger at the cardinal points, whereas all the others are a bit smaller. Those larger ones have a bit more surface area to work with, and have a brushed section running down the middle, flanked on either side by polishing, whereas the smaller indices are just polished. Sitting outside of each of the smaller indices, slightly separated, are additional polished squares. This is a nice little detail, and shows a bit more effort went into this dial, because they could have easily just been one larger piece forming the hour marker, rather than two different applied pieces. At 3, the indice has been cut short to make way for the date complication. This date has an applied frame with a pronounced inner bevel that creates a real feeling of depth when looking at it. Visible, inside is the date of course. Seiko went with a white date wheel and black printing, which doesn't stand out too much from the rest of the dial. As far as dates go, it's about average. There's nothing special going on, but it's not an eyesore. The last aspect of the dial to cover is the minute track, the other bit of printing on the dial. It's got partial minutes marked, which I really like. I pretty much always like this design element on a watch. It creates some nice visual detail without cluttering the dial or making it complicated. It also serves as a frame around the dial as a whole. I know some people think they're a bit unnecessary when the watch isn't a chronograph, but I like it. The hands on this watch are another standout for me. Well, one in particular, but we'll get to that. The hour and minute hands are both Dauphine hands, with a bevel running down the middle to help them catch and play with the light. Unfortunately, both sides are polished, so at the point when this was made, Seiko weren't employing that little trick of frosting one side to help with legibility. That said, the hands are always still pretty legible on the watch. But it's the second hand I'm interested in here. I don't think it's heat blued, but it is a nice rich blue colour and picks out the subtle shades of blue present in the dial too. The counterbalance is a delicate hollow diamond, which really makes this hand look like a needle. Overall proportions are okay, but I think the minute and seconds hand could have been slightly longer to push out a little bit closer to the minute track. There is of course no lume on this watch, either the dial or the hands. Instead, Seiko is relying on the polished surfaces of those hands and indices to help you read the time, even when the lights are turned down. Being a dress watch, I wouldn't expect there to be much or any lume, so it's not really a big deal. Covering all of that is the crystal, and it's not a bad one. Aside from the fact that it's hardlex rather than sapphire, I have no issues with it. It's heavily domed, which suits the watch even though it adds some extra height overall, and, because of that doming, some nice distortion is created when you look at it from an angle. This one here has seen quite a bit of wear, and has some scratches. So yeah, sapphire would have been nice to avoid those. When it comes to the case, it should look familiar if you watched my previous video about my Seiko Starlight. This SARB065 has the exact same case. Or rather, that Starlight has the same case as this. In terms of sizes, we have a case diameter of 40mm, which is on the upper end of what I think a dress watch should be, but still perfectly wearable. That's thanks, in part, to the very reasonable 47.1mm lug-to-lug, and, while the height may seem tall at 13.1mm, you have to remember that a decent amount of that comes from the domed crystal, so visually it's much closer to 10 than 13mm. The only other measurement to mention is the lug width, which maintains the proportions of the watch at 20mm. That also means that if you're not a fan of the stock leather strap, finding something to swap it out with won't be very difficult. Finishing is simple but well done. By finishing, I mean polishing, because that's the only finish this case has. The slim bezel surrounding the dial is polished, the flat tops of the lugs are polished, the flat sides of the case are polished, even the signed crown is polished. But this is a dress watch after all, so all that polish doesn't look out of place. If we look at the case side to see the profile, we can see how the lugs turn down quite a bit from the case, and that's another part of why this watch wears so well. From the side as well, we can see that signed crown I mentioned. It's probably a little bit undersized, and something that they changed on the later Presage model as well, increasing its size. Turning the watch over, the 065 has a display case back that gives us a look through the movement ticking away. This is another change compared to the later Presage model. Where the newer Presage has a 4R35 movement, this SARB has a 6R15. Both do hack, hand wind and beat at 3 Hz, but the 6R movement is just a slight level above the 4R. The rotor has even been decorated a little with that striping. The caseback that we're looking through screws down and gives the watch only 50 meters of water resistance. That's not much, but for this style of watch it's enough. I don't think many people are taking this watch into the pool or the beach. It'll survive getting caught out in the rain, but maybe not a whole lot more. One last thing I want to talk about in relation to the watch is the strap that it comes on from Seiko. It's a black leather 20mm strap with some subtle blue stitching that works really well to pick out that blue second hand on the watch head. The leather is quite shiny and has no texture to it like a crocodile pattern. I personally don't mind it, but back in its time, this watch did receive quite a bit of criticism for the strap. Complaints that it was too stiff and not of very good quality were often thrown around. Maybe I don't have very high standards, or maybe it's because I got this watch second hand, but the strap was already broken in, so I don't really have any issues with it. Sure, it could be a little less shiny, but that's far from a deal breaker, and if I really didn't like it, there's plenty of other 20mm straps out there that would look great on the watch. The factory strap does also come with a deployant buckle, and again, Seiko have done that reversing trick to keep the long end of the strap hidden on the inside of your wrist. However, I'm not a big fan of that, so, as always, I swap it out for the other way around, like you can see here. The result of that is that it can feel like you're closing the clasp backwards versus most bracelet clasps, but it's something I've gotten used to, so it doesn't really affect me. With all that out of the way, let's get it on wrist and see how it wears. Well, it wears very well, which you might have guessed already. It wears just as well as my other cocktail time does, and is very comfortable. Turning my wrist, you get a good look at the light show going on with that dial, and hopefully, you can also see that even though the height on paper is over 13mm, it doesn't look or feel that tall on wrist. If we change up the strap for this brown one, I think it dresses down the watch a little, but still looks really good. The warm tones of the brown work well together in combination with the blues in the dial and that second hand. Another strap I've enjoyed pairing this watch with is this beige one. Like the brown, the warm tones of the strap work really well together with the dial. A lighter colour definitely gives it a bit more of a casual feel, and to me, this combo has a bit of a summery vibe. So, I do like the watch, but that doesn't mean it's a perfect watch. I mentioned that a sapphire crystal would have been nice to not get scratched so easily, but there's an elephant in the room I haven't mentioned yet. This watch, of course, has been discontinued. There is the newer Presage version, but if we're strictly talking about this SARB watch, the only way to get it is to go second hand and pay the sometimes crazy prices being asked. Is it worth it at those inflated prices? No, not really if I'm being honest. Especially not when you can get the newer SARB065 with the same dial for significantly less. Sure, you're not getting a 6-hour movement, but I think that's a trade-off worth making. The only other thing to consider if you're going down this route is that there are other colours available now too. A deeper blue, green, and even brown. So, you don't have to only choose this ice blue colour. If I'm honest, I think I prefer the deeper blue to this one. But this is the original. What do you think about this watch? Do you have a SARB in your collection? What about one of the newer Presage models? Is there a watch with a better dial in the price range? Let me know in the comments, and I'll see you next time.